Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with you after a kind of a lengthy hiatus. We had some things going on, some physical things and having to go places and things of this nature. But we're back with you, and we're going to pick up where we left off with answering the question: who and where is Israel today? To me, we're just now getting into the really important parts of this particular question. Let's go back and lay a little foundation now. Recall God spoke to Abraham. Abraham obeyed him. God made him a promise, an unconditional promise, that his descendants would one day pretty much rule the world. They would dominate the world, and specifically two of his seed, as God called them. He said one of them would be the greatest commonwealth of nations ever. The other one would be the greatest single nation ever. And we have pinpointed that, and I will do more so in this session and maybe the next session, to prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's the United States and Great Britain. But let's go back just a little bit. Remember that we had the big split over taxation when the house of Judah, the Judahites, the king came in, and Solomon's son, and he passed a taxation law, and then the other 10 tribes, called the house of Israel later, they separated. They had this big split. And those that lived out in the northern part called themselves Israel. Those in the upper part, Judah and Benjamin and Levi, they called themselves Judah, later called Judahites or Udahites. Then sometime later, the northern tribes calling themselves Israel, they sinned to the point that God had to send in the Assyrians to destroy them, destroy the nation, and the people that survived that war. They took them back home into Assyria. This was about 720 BC, I'm sorry. And then later the Persians attacked them, and they all scattered. The Assyrians and the Israelites and everybody just scattered all over the world, and disappeared and became lost. Even Jesus Christ himself said, he called them the lost tribes of Israel, the lost tribes of the house of Israel, lost sheep of the house of Israel. So Jesus called them lost. Now God knew where they were, but he was about the only one that knew who they were and where they were. They didn't even know themselves who they were and where they were. They didn't know they were Israelites. And so they were probably talking about the lost tribes of Israel, not knowing they're talking about themselves in all likelihood. Now, because of their being lost, Bible scholars, most Bible so-called scholars, now the word scholar means one who has the answer. Well, you may have the answer, but you may not have the right answer, see. So here's what happened. Many of these scholars assumed that because Israel just disappeared, those 10 tribes just disappeared. Because of that, many people assumed that they were all Jews. That what is called a Jew, the Jews, that's all 12 tribes. And we won't get into why they thought that, but that's what they thought, and they still think that today. I read people, listen to people today, and they'll talk about the Jews, and they think that that's all 12 tribes. They're called Jews. Well, that's not true. The Bible nowhere even indicates that. History shows us that that's not true. So the idea is the Jews constitute all 12 tribes. Now what happened though with the Israelites, and I'll be brief in this because we've talked about it, they scattered and they settled tribe by tribe. The tribes stayed together and they would settle in the various areas of Europe. And wherever they settled, they assimilated with the local people. In other words, socially they became like them. They finally lost their language. They spoke the language of the people. And finally they lost their religion. They lost their God. They lost the law. They lost all of that and became like the people. Now the thing about it is, most of the people in that part of the world at that time, and well, all over the world, were sun worshippers. These were people who worshipped the sun, and they had a god of the sun. In other words, called the sun god, and that's where we get the word Sunday. Sunday was the day that the heathen worshipped the sun. The day when they dedicated that day to the sun, and they would have these sunrise services to go out. When the sun came up, they would worship that sun as it came up. Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you, I have done that. Now, I didn't realize what I was doing, but I was actually worshiping the sun, or the sun god, by participating in these sunrise services, especially on Easter. And the fact that I even had anything to do with Easter is embarrassing, because that's a pagan holiday. And God hates it. He despises it. It's an abomination to him. Now, one reason, probably the main reason, well, two reasons why the world thinks that the Israelites are no longer exist, that they're all Jews, is because, first of all, they don't know where the Israelites are. Therefore, they assume they're Jews. But secondly, the Jews have kept God's sign. God said, I'm going to give you a sign, and that will show you who are my people. And if you don't observe that sign, you are not my people. Well, we're going to talk about that sign just a little more shortly. Now, well, let's go on into it. What was the sign? What was the sign that God gave all of Israel, actually, but the Jews kept the sign? They recognize the sign to this day. For example, if I ask you that in your area, do you have any Jews? And you can tell me, yes, we have a family, or 2 or 3 families, or whatever. Well, how do you know they're Jews? What's the sign that they are Jews? They have kept God's Sabbath. That's the sign that God gave them, that will distinguish his people, the Jews, from the Gentiles. The word Gentile means heathen. In other words, if you don't observe that sign, you are a heathen in the eyes of God. Now, God made a separate covenant. After he gave the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, which is also called Mount Horeb. Let me explain something while we're talking about this. Middle Eastern people are very adept at what they call play on words. And you'll see this in the Bible, and it can be confusing if you don't understand it. For example, they'll give a particular entity several different names. I know of 4 different names of the Sea of Galilee that are in the Bible. 4 different words that mean Galilee. And Mount Sinai is also in the Bible called Mount Horeb. People were called by different names. Peter was called Simon. He's called Peter. He's called Kepa, K-E-P-A. So this is the way things are in the Middle East. And another thing that throws people is the word "and." Now that's an English word, but they may say something to you. Well, how is your wife? And how is that dear woman that you care so much about? Well, here in the English-speaking country, that means 2 different people, but not them. It was the same person. And you'll find that word "and" to the English mind, that means 2 different entities, but not there. In that language, it's the same person. The church of the Israel of God is also called the church, but it says the church and the Israel of God. Well, it's one and the same. The church is the Israel of God. This is in Galatians 6:16, I believe, something like that. Now, God said, this was sometime after he gave the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, one of which concerned the Sabbath. Later on, probably around 9 months later, you find this recorded in Exodus 31. He said, now he's talking to Moses. He said, I'm going to make a special covenant, another covenant that will really define beyond a doubt who my people are. And he said, I'm going to give them a sign. And this sign will identify who my people really are. And if you don't adhere to that sign, then you're not really spiritually my people. Well, you know, God uses signs a lot. For example, remember when the Pharisees asked Jesus, said, well, give us a sign that will tell us who you are. And Jesus said, I'm going to give you one sign. And remember, he said, one sign. He's talking to the Pharisees. He says, I'm going to give you people one sign that will tell you exactly who I am. I will be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. Just as Jonah was in the heart of the belly of the fish, I, the Son of Man, will be in the tomb, or in the belly of the earth, heart of the earth, 3 days and 3 nights. You know what's amazing? The church can't count to 3. You realize this? Church can't count to 3. All right? When does the church say that he died? Friday late, just before sundown on Friday. Then he was in the tomb Friday night, all day Saturday, and Saturday night. And when does the church say he was resurrected? Before daylight on Sunday. That's 1 day and 2 nights. Now tell me how you get 3 days and 3 nights out of that. Well, it's because they can't count to 3. And they don't believe God's word. Well, that was a sign. Well, in other words, when people like me say he was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, they call me a liar. That can't be, because, well, as an aside, I'm bad to chase rabbits, but here's another rabbit. Where do we get the idea of Good Friday? What's Good Friday? What's good about Friday? Because the Catholics have told us that Jesus died on Friday. He did not. He died on Wednesday, just before sundown. Anyhow, and why do we have fish on Friday? There was a time when in the public schools where we had fish on Friday in the public schools because of the Catholics. Now, in my part of the country, there weren't that many Catholics, so that wasn't so enforced. But the farther north and west and east you went, where the Catholic influence is much greater, you had fish on Friday. There was a time when they offered fish on airlines. You could have, if you were Catholic and you were going to eat a meal on an airline, fish was one of the options. Why? To appease the Catholic people. Now, what is it about fish? What does that have to do with anything? Well, as you know, if you've heard me talk very much, there was a time back in the 300s when the Catholic Church was using the Roman government to force everybody into the Catholic Church. If you didn't come in, you died unless you escaped. Well, the multitudes of heathen were coming in. Some of them worshipped a fish god whose Sabbath was Friday. And his name was Dagon. You look up in the Bible dictionary, you find out he's mentioned in the Bible. Dagon, the fish god. Well, his Sabbath was Friday, so therefore, to appease the Dagon fish god worshippers, the Catholics said, well, we'll have Catholic as the day that Jesus died. And that's where you get Good Friday, you see. Anyhow, go to the Word, ladies and gentlemen. Don't listen to people. Don't listen to me. Check it out. Go to the Word. Now, this sign. Now, I'm going to read something from you. We have a tendency to listen to preachers. The last people you want to listen to, ladies and gentlemen, are traditional, institutional church preachers. I don't care who they are. I don't care how great they are. We just buried one recently that, I mean, you would have thought he was Christ himself. I've heard him. I've heard him many, many times. I will not listen to one of his sermons again. But anyhow, well, of course, not live anyway, he's dead. But anyhow, I won't listen to anything that he had to say because I heard too much. I know the truth. Now, let's find out about this Sabbath situation. Go to Exodus 31, verses 12 through 16. I'm going to read this very carefully. It's important, ladies and gentlemen, to study carefully, word for word. And the Lord spake to Moses, verse 12, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, now you tell them this, verily, that means, I mean business here, I mean this to be done. My Sabbaths you will keep. For it, his Sabbaths, is a sign between me and you, Israel, throughout your generations. As long as there's an Israelite, this sign will be in effect. And that sign is his keeping his Sabbaths, that you may know that I am the Lord who does sanctify you. Ladies and gentlemen, the word sanctify means to set aside. And in a scriptural sense, it means to set aside for holy use. He said, you people I have set aside for holy use if you keep my Sabbaths. Now the word keep is a military word, and it means to guard. In other words, he was saying to them, there are going to be people who will draw you away from my Sabbath. Guard that Sabbath. Put a guard around it. In a military sense, is place guards with weapons around it so that nobody can get to it. He said, do that to my Sabbath. Verse 14, you shall keep, again, guard, the Sabbath. Now he's talking about the weekly Sabbath. Therefore, for it is holy to you, and every one that defiles it shall be put to death. Now, in those days, they put them to death right then. Today, they will be put to death when Christ returns, you see. For whosoever does any work on that Sabbath, that soul, that person, shall be cut off from his people. In other words, put to death. For 6 days you may work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day, the Sabbath of rest. It is holy to the Lord, and whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. Ladies and gentlemen, God's serious about this. As long as there's an Israelite, everyone who calls himself by the name of God must keep that Sabbath, because that is his Sabbath. Now, understand this. The Sabbath is a space of time. It's a 24-hour block of time. God's Sabbath begins on Friday evening at sundown. When the last part of that sun disappears beyond the horizon, that is my Sabbath. And I look right out my front window, and I can tell you exactly when my Sabbath begins. Of course, people on the other side of the world, it's different. But that's beside the point. For them, their Sabbath may come later or earlier, whichever. Doesn't matter. God looks at obedience. He said, when that sun goes down, when you've seen the last of it, that's when the next day begins. And it ends when the next day's sun goes down. That's the day. That day ends and the next one begins. God's Sabbath, as he tells us in the book of Genesis, God's Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. In those days, you see, they didn't have the days named like we do, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They didn't have. They had numbers. Say the first day of the week, the third day of the week, the seventh day of the week is the Sabbath of God. We are to keep it holy. And how do we keep it holy? We don't work. We don't play. We dedicate, we sanctify that word unto the Lord, and therefore He will sanctify us unto Him. And how do we do that? By getting into His word. Remember, Jesus said in John 17:17, He's praying to God. He said, Lord, sanctify them, talking about the apostles. He said, sanctify them according to your truth. Your word is truth. That's a quote from Jesus Christ. So if we're going to be sanctified by God, we have to obey His word. And His word says, sanctify my Sabbath. And notice He didn't say it's Israel's Sabbath or a Gentile Sabbath. He said that is my Sabbath. And I command you to keep it, to guard it. Don't let yourself be sucked into doing something that you should not do on the Sabbath. 6 days you shall do your work. But on the seventh day is my Sabbath. And it is sanctified. And if you're going to be sanctified, you must observe my Sabbath according to my rules and regulations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how do you make it any clearer than that? And he said, as long as there's an Israelite throughout their generations, as long as there is an Israelite on this earth alive, that covenant will stand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you got anywhere from, I've seen estimates of 12 to 20 million Jews. Well, they're Israelites, you see. But that's not near all of them, of course. That's just 3 tribes, probably less than 5%. Well, what about all the others? Those that are supposedly lost that we're going to find here very shortly. Where are they supposed to be keeping the Sabbath? Are they alive on the earth today? Yes. Well, what does that mean? That means we are supposed to be keeping God's Sabbath. And he said, this is a sign between me and you, Israel. Well, who is Israel today? Well, I have proven to you, and I'll prove again, the Israel he's talking about is England and the United States. He says, as long as any of you folks are alive, you will observe my Sabbaths if you're going to be part of my people. And unfortunately, 99.9% of the people who call themselves His people don't keep Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? It means they're not His people. See, all who are of Israel are not of Israel. Now, God said that. He said all of Israel is not spiritual Israel. Spiritual Israel, those are the people who obey His word. You know, He talks about in Revelation, He talks about false Jews. He said there are people who say they're Jews, but they're not Jews. Well, what's He talking about? They say that they're a part of the church. They say that they're spiritually my people. He said they're liars. They're not my people. Yes, they are the children of Abraham. Yes, they are the descendants of Isaac and Jacob and so on. But they're not my people. They are counterfeits, pretenders. They're just my people physically. They're not my people spiritually. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to get this right. Because if you don't get it right, you don't get it, period. We're either for Him or against Him. We're either gathering with Him or scattering abroad. And if we're not keeping that sign, if that's not our sign, if that's not the sign we're under as people, these astrologers talk about, what sign am I under? The sign of God. I observe the Sabbath, and that's today. And I don't do anything today that does not in some way have something to do with the Word of God or prayer, this type of thing. Because He said, set that day aside, sanctify that day, don't do anything. You don't play golf, you don't go shopping, you don't mow your yard. You get with God and stay with God for that 24-hour period. That's sanctifying. That's guarding that day. That's putting a shield around that day to make sure that Satan doesn't entice you to do something else on that day. Now let me warn you, as I often do, if you do that, you're going to be in trouble. And that trouble is going to come from the church. Because church people don't like God's Word. They hate God's Word. They despise God's Word, and therefore despise God, as we're told in Luke 10:16. He said, whoever despises my word, in other words, won't obey my word, despise both me and my Father. That word despise means exactly what it says. It's tantamount to hate. You're showing your disapproval of God. That's a Gentile, ladies and gentlemen. That's heathenistic belief. So we're going to stop there, and until next time, remember, study God's Word.